Thanks everybody for joining us today. You're here with Sales Intel and Never Lose the Deal. We're going to be talking about building a winning sales team. My name's Jason. I'm Vice President of Partnerships and Alliances at Sales Intel, and I'm extremely excited to have Ganesh here with us, who's the CEO of Never Lose the Deal. Ganesh, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Jason. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to this group here. And in terms of building and winning sales teams, this is something that I've been quite passionate about. I have 20 plus years of experience working in different roles within the sales organizations, as well as working with sales organizations. And for the past 5 years at Never Lose the Deal, we've been really helping fast growing technology companies to grow their top line revenue by helping them build winning teams, high-performing teams, by both helping them on the talent aspect as well as on the sales processes aspects, right? So I'm really, what I'm trying to do here today is distill this down to very, very crisp objectives, learning objectives. We're going to take a quick look at what is the holistic approach of evaluating both the job as well as the team fit for a particular candidate. So we're going to look at ways we can leverage data and science to understand what drives your employees so that you can use that data not only during the hiring process, but also effectively manage them and ensure that you have the right team dynamics to make your team a winning team. One of the things that sales leaders often would like to have is a magic wand that they can wave that helps them replicate all their top performance. So you're going to look at some ways in which you could do that by identifying certain attributes of top performers that can be replicated as you're hiring and growing your organizations. So with those learning objectives in mind, one of the agenda that we have here for today is, first, we're going to start with understanding some of the common challenges sales leaders face. And then we're going to look at what distinguishes really the winning teams and the so average teams, right? And what are the forces of disengagement that pull down the performance in teams, and how we can counter that, those forces of engagement through a very systematic talent management framework that we use here to create winning teams. We're going to illustrate a few real life sales examples that you can all probably relate to, and show you how you can use data to counter those situations. And then we'll wrap this up with a few minutes for Q&A. If that sounds like a plan, I'll dive right in. Jason, is that okay?
Yep, sounds perfect.
So let's first look at what are the top challenges sales leaders face, right? And they generally fall into 3 categories, right? Talent, process, and technologies. There was a survey recently that was done by the RAIN group of over 400 sales leaders. And out of the top 10 challenges that were identified by sales leaders, 5 of them fall under the talent bucket, right? Whether it's recruiting and hiring, whether it's developing sales skills or developing sales managers, coaching and onboarding new team members, these all factor in these top 10 challenges sales leaders face. And the interesting thing is, more than half of sales leaders surveyed have said that hiring and recruiting the right people has been quite challenging. In the past 5 to 10 years, much progress has been made on improving sales processes and deploying new technologies and tools, right from prospecting to qualification to negotiations and closing and account nurture once you close accounts. And Sales Intel is a great example of how you use tools and technologies in the front end to do better prospecting. However, when it comes to embracing data, and when it comes to managing talent, right, even though sales leaders recognize that that is one of their top challenges, the usage of data has been pretty minimal when it comes to talent, right? Most of the talent-based decisions tend to be based on gut and intuition instead of data. And my attempt in this presentation today is to impress you with some aspects you should look at from a data and science perspective, so that you can have a better appreciation of how the talent aspect can also be managed with data. So now let's look at what distinguishes the average teams from the winning teams, right? The discretionary effort that's put in by teams helps explain high performance and engagement, right? The average teams tend to kind of stay at that, the lower curve that you see here in red, and they tend to go by basic job descriptions, barely meeting the job descriptions, not tend to innovate. They do not create raving fans among their customer base. They're either typically missing their quota or barely meeting their quota. Whereas when you look at the winning teams, right, they're always pushing the higher limits when it comes to growing their engagement and performance. They always want to do more and put in a lot of discretionary effort. These are team members that are not typically just working for a paycheck. They always go the extra mile, deeply care about what their customers think, value their own time, and in terms of what activities they engage their time in. And they're always looking at ways to improve efficiency and tend to put in much more long hours compared to the average teams. Why does this happen, right? There are four forces that IO psychologists have identified that are working against us and that block organizations from achieving great results. These forces tend to pull the performance of the organizations down into that want-to curve, from that want-to curve into the have-to line. The first force is what is called the job fit. And this is characterized typically by poorly defined position descriptions, sloppy hiring processes and methods, and then mismatches that happen because of evolving business needs that create a difference between what the employees and their roles need, right? The lack of a job fit directly impacts the way somebody gets motivated and their productivity. Someone who's in a wrong role or someone who doesn't have the right support to do the job is not going to be excited about the work they do every day, right? And again, most important aspect of this here is a mishire, right? Can not only be devastating to the individual performance, but also tends to impact the morale of the others around them as well as the entire team. The second factor that pulls performance down is what is called the manager impact, right? And this is, it's evident that the relationship between employees and the managers is quite critical. However, many managers are very poorly equipped and not trained to effectively understand what their employees' needs are, right? And they struggle to communicate with and motivate their employees, and that results in lower performance and engagement. The third aspect is the cultural misalignment. And this is another critical area that blocks people from and organizations from achieving great results. In order to be productive and engaged, employees need to feel that they belong, right? When they are out of tune with either the organization's values or when they lose trust in the leadership, their own performance suffers and they create a toxic work environment that undermines productivity. The fourth force of disengagement is team. This is about teamwork today is even more critical than ever, especially in the environments where we're all working remotely and working across organizations even in a global scale. Still, poor communication and insufficient collaboration and the inability to manage the tensions that are inherent in working together continue to extract a massive tax on productivity and innovation. And needless to say, toxic teams put your goals at risk.
Hey, Ganesh, real quick on this. Obviously, the better that you can hire the right people for these fits, the better you're going to do. But how much of your success and time and effort should be spent on that side of the equation, trying to find the right people for the right fit, versus trying to try and accommodate or customize some of these things, like the nature of the job, how the manager deals with the team, stuff like that, to better accommodate that employee. Where do you kind of see that breakdown?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jason, and it really depends on your organization stage, right? So if you are a very fast growing company, as I know Sales Intel is, you probably want to put a lot of energy into the initial stages of that hiring and making sure that you're bringing the right people into the right roles, because that's what defines the rest of the elements, right? Whereas if you're a mature organization with a lot of employees, then you want to focus more on how well they're being managed and adjusting their job roles to their unique strengths and building the culture and the team-based work environment, right? But again, all these four factors are interrelated, right? They're not in unison. For today's purpose, I'm going to highlight and focus mostly around the job fit aspect and the manager impact aspect, because we got only 30 minutes or so. But there's a lot that can be done with data related to culture and team dynamics as well. Okay, so moving on, the framework that we use to counter these four forces of disengagement and create winning teams is called talent optimization. Most sales leaders have a well-defined sales strategy, and have a very good idea of what results need to be achieved, right? It's very rare for sales teams to not have a well-defined quota, sometimes most of the times quarterly, and for sure annual quotas in long life cycle businesses, and few KPIs that everyone has to meet, right? In spite of having clear sight of these goals, the majority of the sales teams tend to miss quota, right? The reason for that is that the middle piece, which is the optimization of the talent and the infrastructure, is the piece that's missing. And what we do is take a scientific and systematic based approach to build teams that need to execute on the strategy. The first step of that is to really create that talent infrastructure and design the overall sales strategy, design the overall talent strategy that will enable you to execute on the sales strategy. Again, that design is based on the context of what the sales strategy is and what results need to be achieved. Once you have that in place, the next step is then you go hire the right people into the right roles. And again, hiring the right talent is critical, but you also have to keep the employees happy and engaged in order for them to be productive, right? So how do you use data and science to make sure that you're inspiring and managing the teams in the most effective manner? The fourth aspect of this is about diagnosing at regular intervals so that you're monitoring the people data on a periodic basis and appreciating things that are working well, and also identifying the gaps in your talent infrastructure so that you can take corrective action and fix them. When somebody thinks about evaluating a person to determine whether they're most effective in an organization or not, people are very quick to look at the knowledge, skills, and experience aspects of someone that they're bringing into your role. That is typically represented by the briefcase here, right? You see here, right? It's that knowledge, the years of experience they have, the skill set they have, and the educational background that they have. The heart tends to represent things like values and interests that someone has, and what are they passionate about, right? Are they a good fit for your culture? And we tend to uncover some of these things during the interview process. The interesting thing about this is that the heart and the briefcase do change over time, right? Someone's skills can be enhanced through training, knowledge can grow with experience, and values and interests can also change depending on the environment that somebody is in. But at the top, you can see that you see the head piece, right? Which is, in this model, represents a person's innate drives and cognitive abilities, right? The innate drives is where we can actually use behavioral data, capture and measure behavioral data so that you can help evaluate the critical aspect of a given person. And the interesting thing is that the head part, right, the behavioral drives and the cognitive ability tends to stay stable in any person, right? So it's important that while we're going to look at the behavioral drives today in the examples and the concepts we're looking at today, you need to consider all three factors when you're evaluating somebody and their performance in a given role, right? So it's really important that all three factors are considered. So now let's look at what are the factors that constitute this, the head piece, right? There are four primary factors that give us insights into what drives a person. Each factor, as you can see here in the middle, has the midpoint. And if you have somebody that's onto the right, that means that they're high on that particular factor. And if somebody is onto the left, they're low on that factor. And again, there's nothing good or bad about being high or low. It's just that it shows that if you're further to the right, that means you have a higher propensity to be exhibiting that factor and expressing that factor, versus if you're onto the low side, you have a lower tendency to exhibit that factor. So let's first look at the first factor, which is the dominance, which is the drive to exert one's influence on either people or events. Somebody that has a high level of dominance tends to be more independent, competitive, and quite assertive. This is a characteristic typically you want to see in people that are in sales roles, whether it's in SDR or sales director roles. And again, the level at which you want to see that depends on that particular job and the company. But in general, you want people that tend to have high level of dominance. Somebody that has low dominance tends to be very collaborative, right? Cooperative, accommodating, agreeable is how we would describe somebody that has low level of dominance. Even within the sales function, right? There are certain roles that you probably want them to be more collaborative than independent and competitive, right? Sales ops or sales enablement role is a great example of that, right? When you look at the second factor, extroversion, this is all about the drive for social interaction with other people, right? These are people with high levels of extroversion tend to be outgoing, enthusiastic, and gregarious. And again, for a majority of the sales roles, this is a characteristic that you want because you want them to be able to connect with people quickly and be able to pursue opportunities relatively easily. On the low side, when you have somebody that's lower on extroversion, they tend to be introspective, analytical, and reflective, right? And again, a sales ops person, right? Probably you want them to be a bit more analytical and reflective versus extroversion, right? So again, depending on the role, you need to look for these type of factors. The next factor is what is called the patience, and this is the drive for consistency and stability. It influences a person's perceived pace in their work, right? People that tend to have high patience tend to be very calm, steady, and patient, whereas people with low patience tend to be very high in their drive and want to be in an environment that's fast-paced, right? And again, for sales organizations that are fast-growing and are innovating, you want people that have low patience and not high patience, right, in that organization. The fourth factor is formality, which is the drive to conform to rules and structure, right? Typically, people with high formality tend to be very precise, organized, and somewhat serious in their nature. And on the lower end of the spectrum of formality, they're the ones that tend to be very flexible and non-conforming and informal, right? And again, in the sales context, depending on the role and the maturity of the organization, you probably want some level of formality, because in very high level of formality indicates, very low level of formality indicates that you're probably not good at follow through, right? So that's something that you need to take into account. And again, if you understand which one of these drives are strongest in a particular individual, and these can also, by the way, be measured at a team level, you will be able to understand how to appeal to those drives, and you can work with that person in a very effective manner. Now let's look at some examples, and first we'll take the job fit aspect of it, and we'll look at a real life example. The job we're looking at here is a sales hunter job in a fast growing SaaS company. This job requires you, the person in this role, to quickly connect with people and sell over the phone. They need to be able to juggle multiple tasks. They need to be task oriented and goal oriented, or less tolerant to risk, and be very self-driven. So when you look at the job profile, this is how it looks like. And again, ICP, or ideal customer profile, is a concept that most sales leaders are familiar with. Think of this as more like an ideal employee profile, right? This is something, in this particular role, you want somebody that's unafraid of rejection. So you want someone that's high in their dominance. You want them to be able to connect with people. So that's why you see the extroversion factor to be high. And you want somebody that has a very high level of drive. So you see a very low patience that is a requirement for this job. And you want them to have enough formality, which is because of the follow through that's needed. So now when you look at Heather, yes.
One more quick question on that. So I would imagine that there's a lot of similarity in these roles between organizations where you can have a general profile, but also imagine that within specific organizations or even industries or verticals, there's going to be some variability that's fairly consistent, either at the individual organization level or the industry or vertical level, where the plot on this may deviate. How do you generally tackle that where this is going to deviate from the more general trend?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and there's three ways we tend to come up with this ideal employee profile for a particular role, right? The first way is if you have an existing organization and you know who your top performers are, you measure the behavioral profiles of your top performers, and that gives you a good indication of what should be the ideal employee profile, right? That's one. If you don't have that luxury of a lot of employees that are in that current role, then what you want to do is do a stakeholder assessment. So you want to get this type of a input from at least three constituents, right? Somebody that's already in that role, the manager of that role, as well as stakeholders that interact with that role, right? So those 3 data points help you gain consensus on what profile needs to be. The third way is, and there's a tool that we use that helps answer certain questions related to what that job entails and the culture of the company. And based on that, there is science and data that works in the background that provides you this ideal employee profile, right? And again, you could use a combination of all these 3 and come up with a consensus of what is the right ideal employee profile, but there's multiple ways that can be handled. Does that answer the question, Jason?
Yeah. About what do you need as a minimum threshold as far as sample size typically?
In terms of using the first method, I would say at least have 3 employees that are top performers that you consider as top performers, right? That'll be a good indicator for determining it. In the other 2 cases, you don't need a sample size. You can come up with that just based on interviews and answering those questions.
Great. Yeah, that was the first one I was asking mostly about.
Yeah,
all right, thank you.
Yeah. Great. So now let's look at Heather, this is again based on a real person, but we masked the identities. She's somebody that's highly intelligent and bilingual, has an MBA, reasonably successful in sales, someone that seeks results, likes to be perfect, more task or people oriented, and a bit slower to connect, right? So if you look at what her profile looks like, this is Heather's pattern, right? You can see that she's a driven person by her high dominance factor. She's a bit more introspective, as you can see by her low extroversion factor. She's somebody that seeks results and likes to be perfect, right? And does take time to warm up to people. Now let's look at how that fits in with the job profile or the ideal employee profile we put together, right? Clearly, there's a huge disparity between the extroversion and the patience factors for Heather in this particular role, right? So she's spot on when it comes to her level of independence and dominance that's required for that role. And there is some level of disparity on the formality factor. But the biggest concern for Heather being in this role is the gap she has on the extroversion and the patience factors, right? So one of the things that we were able to do by using this pattern is to coach Heather into considering another position within the organization, which is a post-sales implementation role that she was moved into, and she's been quite happy in that role, and she still continues to be in that role today, right? So this is an example of how you can use the target data and the profile of individual to see, to use that data to be able to not only coach if there's minor gaps, but also figure out if there's a better way for that person to add value to the organization. So now let's look at the second blocker to peak performance, which is the manager impact, right? The saying that people don't quit their job, but they quit their manager is a perfect summary of describing this force, right? Managers and employees have different styles, right? The highest drive that you have in your behavioral profile is the one that is a great predictor of your management style, right? If your highest drive is the dominance factor, then you tend to be more of an authoritative tell style manager, right? General Patton is a great example of that, right? Very comfortable with leading the charge, very comfortable making decisions, and you just tell people what to do and expect them to follow you, right? If you have the extroversion as your dominant drive, then you're less of a tell and more of a sell, right? Martin Luther King is a great example of this, right? With his I Have a Dream, you're more showing people the great cause and rallying the troops to follow you instead of telling them what to be done. The third one is people that have a very high level of patience, right? And people might be surprised to see Steve Jobs in this category, because from all the anecdotes, people tend to think Steve Jobs is more of the authoritative tell style. But in reality, Steve Jobs is very much of a process and experience-based manager, because he is the craftsman like execution, right? He was very popular for not even having product release dates and letting products be released unless he really feels comfortable that it's executed to perfection. The ones that tend to have the high formality are more structure or rules driven, right? Alan Mulally, who is the former CEO of Boeing and Ford, is a great example of that, right? He was famous for avoiding the bailout and turning around Ford through the Great Recession, right? His style of management was through data, KPIs, and dashboards, and he was judging not so much on style, but on the results. Now, just like managers, right, employees tend to have their needs too. And again, the highest behavior pattern tends to be a great predictor of employee needs as well, right? People with a high A are the ones that tend to have the need to make an impact. And this is something that we've seen even at very junior levels. People with high B, which is the extroversion factor, are people that want to be able to bounce ideas off, needs feedback and assurance. People with the high patience, as you can imagine, right, they need to be given time, right? They can't be thrown into the fire and asked to figure out solutions, right? They need to be given time for them to be able to do quality work. The ones that have high formality are the ones that need to be given a lot of details for them to be able to be successful in that role. So let's just quickly dive into a quick example of Alan, who is in a director of sales role. He's somebody that needs feedback and the opportunity to influence and loves to connect with people. He's been quite successful in his role and has a good Rolodex within the telecom industry that he operates in. And Vanessa comes in as the new CRO, and she is quite direct, hard charger, comfortable with conflict, and operationally focused. Now, if you look at the profiles of these two individuals and look at the highest dominating factor, the extroversion is the highest dominating factor for Alan, and that requires him to be given a lot of feedback and he wants to think things through. Whereas if you look at the management style of Vanessa with her high dominance factor, she is somebody that wants to tell, right? You can imagine the conversations going something like, I want to get these deals closed, where is the data? I want the KPIs, etc. And that frustrates Alan, right? If Vanessa doesn't adapt herself and just goes with her natural style, then that frustrates Alan. And you can see that Alan at some point will end up leaving and taking the Rolodex that he has to the competitors, right? So those sort of situations tend to arise quite commonly, and you've got to ask, whose fault is that, right? Both need to be aware of each other's behavioral traits, but the onus has to be on the manager, right? The manager needs to really adapt his or her style to the employee's needs and work based on their dominant drives. Now we're almost at the top of the hour here, so let's walk away with some of the key takeaways here, right? The first takeaway I would want you to walk away with is make sure that you really understand what are the behavioral drives that are required for that particular role and align the right people with those behavioral drives into that role. The next takeaway is about making sure you analyze and utilize the behavioral data on a regular basis to coach and manage your teams. And what we've seen here today is just a glimpse of how you can use the people data to be able to manage and achieve job fit. But there are many more things that you can do with this behavioral data. When you look at, you can look at team dynamics and how teams operate at an aggregate level, as well as you can look at teams that are winning and teams that are not performing well, and you can improve on it. And there's a lot you can do with that data. So make sure you capture and use the people data so that you can build winning teams. So what I would like to conclude with is asking you to think about, based on what you learned today, what is it you want to do differently going forward, right? Is there one thing that you want to be able to do differently based on what you learned today? And one of the things that I would like to offer today, if you do not have a behavioral profile of you've done recently, is offer you a free assessment that you can take, and it should take only about 5 minutes for you to take the assessment. If you send me your email, I'll send you a link to take the assessment. And for attending this webinar, I'll make sure I include both your management styles as well as the selling styles as part of that report. With that, I want to hand over to Jason and see if you have any questions that we could answer.
Yep. Thanks so much, Ganesh. This was great. So yeah, if anybody has any questions, go ahead and pop that into the Zoom side panel. Looks like we already have a few of them in here. So we're running a little bit over, but we'll hang around and answer any questions anybody has. So Ganesh, the first one, somebody is a new pilot and they're planning on hiring a seasoned sales leader to stand up through your sales strategy. They're asking, what are the prerequisites for this? What are the questions they should be asking themselves prior to hiring? What conditions should be in place?
Yeah, I think whether it's a sales leadership role or whether it is any other sales role, right? I think you need to go through the diligence of trying to understand what are the behaviors that are expected out of the role, right? And there are many behavioral assessment tools that are out there that will help you determine what those are, right? And I think once you do that and identify the targets for the behaviors on those 4 areas that we looked at, that's what determines who you should be bringing in. And when you're hiring, make sure all the candidates take an assessment that gives you a good indication of how good a fit are they compared to those behaviors.
Great. All right, next is Patty's asking, do you have any resources that would map out several sales roles against those characteristics? As someone who is starting to build out a sales team, this could be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, as we were going through the certain examples, right, I was giving you examples of what is typically expected in sales roles. But again, every organization is unique and every industry is unique, right? So there is no one size fits all answer to this question, Patty. I'll be happy to take it offline and specifically look at what your particular situation is and give you a sense for what you should be looking at in terms of traits. And again, it depends on the role, right? Because sales teams have different roles, whether it's sales development representatives or directors of sales or account managers or sales operations. So depending on the role, right, you have different characteristics that you need to be looking out for. It's not a one size fits all answer.
Great. We've got one asking, so what are the tools you're actually using that you were talking about when it comes to the behavioral profiles?
Yeah, there are many tools that capture various aspects of the behavioral profiles, and they use slightly different terminologies, but they essentially try to do the same. The one that we particularly use in our practice is a PI behavioral assessment. The reason why we do that is because number one, it's quite scalable because it takes only 5 minutes or so to do an assessment, so you can apply it across all new hires as well, and candidates can take the assessment as well. So the one that I prefer and recommend is PI behavioral assessment.
Right. And then we have someone asking, how can they know their behavioral pattern? I assume that was what you were saying, if they email you, that you can help them build their own behavioral profile?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think if you can send an email and ask me for it, I'll send you a link, and it should take about 5 minutes or so for you to take it, and I'll send you the report.
Awesome. Awesome. And we'll, when we do the follow-up email, I'll also be sure and point that out and include your email address on it so that they can follow up with that. All right. I think that was all of our questions. Ganesh, thank you so much. This has been a really great presentation today. And thanks everybody else for joining us today.
Thanks, Jason. I enjoyed it very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.